Well, let's discuss what this move could potentially mean for South Africa. And for that, we're joined by the Editor-in-Chief of Staff, Toby Shapshak. Toby, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm keen to hear just how much we know about Starlink, right? The president talking about how they've got a presence in 70 countries. But what is it exactly that is being offered to South Africa here?
Well, we don't have the details yet of what the president discussed with, or the government discussed with Starlink. But this is the essence of Starlink. Let's just take a step back. Elon Musk owns a company called SpaceX. Space Exploration is its full name, and they are very good at launching things into space. They have a bunch of rockets. They are now the only way the Americans can get people up and down from the International Space Station after this Boeing Starliner disaster. But they are a very efficient operation when it comes to putting things in space. And one of the things they've done, which is one of Musk's good ideas, and it really is a good idea, is, well, we've got these rockets, we're taking them into space, we can use them for our own payloads, which is what you call the thing you put on a rocket to go to space. And part of those have been these Starlink satellites. They're very small satellites. They hover, hang, float around the planet at a very low orbit. So they're quite low to the ground, as it were. And that means you don't need quite as strong a signal to reach them. And then what you have is a satellite terminal at the bottom. It looks a bit, kind of think about it as like a portable DStv dish. People are familiar what a DStv dish, stick it on the side of the house. This is you lay it on the ground and the dish points up to the satellites and you get the signal. And of course, Starlink truly came of age during the Ukraine war when Russia invaded. That's how you say it, Mr. President. When Russia invaded and attacked Ukraine, they were without telecommunications. Obviously, the Russians targeted their cell phone networks, etc. But because of Starlink, which is based in space, they can't attack the infrastructure, and therefore they have been able to continue to use communications infrastructure the Ukrainians have and the Ukrainian military. And in fact, this is the kind of use case that really proves how useful something like Starlink can be if you go into a conflict situation. But of course, we really want to see what the positive aspects are for us. And in Africa, the use case is a very obvious one, which is we have a very big continent. Once you're outside of an urban area, it's very difficult to get fast, decent internet access, even 5G. And Starlink is a wonderful solution for that. The obvious people who would benefit that are mines, schools, rural communities. And what's great about it is the base station is quite expensive. I think it's about 12,000 Rand, and then you've got monthly fees. I do know people who have used them. I haven't used them myself. There's a company an American company that has some staff in South Africa that I know about, and they were worried about load shredding. So they insisted they bought their staff internet access so they could always be online no matter what. And that's the kind of the extreme use case of it. The more likely use case is, can you imagine what it will do for kids living in rural towns if they could have this kind of internet access? It's very hard to get fast internet access, but not via satellite, as DStv has proved to us. So Starlink, I think, has got a really good business case for providing internet access to South Africans. It's expensive. It's not really something you could do in a normal household, or I couldn't justify it as an expense for my business. But if you have no other resource, and you could do that. So it's obviously, that's the context of Space Link and SpaceX. It's obviously a really good story for South Africa that our very own Elon Musk, we're not so quick to claim him, given the shenanigans that have happened at Twitter, and his brazen, embrace of the right-wing philosophies. So we're still proud of him, I think. It certainly seems like the president is, and we want to give that access to our citizens, especially given that there's 6 other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. who are currently using it.
Okay, but let's talk about what the blockages might be here, because you've already got ICASA, for instance, that say that they've yet to receive a formal application from Starlink for services for them to operate in the country. So what do you make of that? And then I know that, in fact, all of this coming up when the ICASA chairperson was being asked about, I suppose, even the relevance of regulators of telecoms business in South Africa. But what do you make of that particular argument and where you think it should go?
So ICASA is a weird kettle of fish, isn't it? Because its job is to regulate the South African communication industry. But we live in a world that has far outstripped that kind of regulation. And you see it with MultiChoice. You know, MultiChoice is fighting against Netflix, Amazon, Disney, and yet it's still hamstrung by broadcast legislation in South Africa, even though it operates throughout the continent. We're still the biggest market. So ICASA has a whole bunch of legislation. It's clumsy and it's difficult, and there's a lot of debate. I'm not going to talk about BEE, but there's a lot of debate in the market about whether it's been effective, whether it's achieved its goals, whether it continues to be effective. And that, of course, is the real hurdle, I think, for many international companies, not just Starlink. If you want to operate a business in South Africa, the regulators will say you need a local partner and you need to empower them, or you need to give them shares, or you need to do something. Most international companies, and I've been told this privately for the last 30 years by executives of big international companies coming to South Africa, tech firms, obviously, and they're all just bemused. They're like, okay, we know apartheid was a bad thing, but that's like 20 years ago. Why are we still having to fix it for you guys? Why haven't you guys fixed it yourself? And that's the attitude of international businessmen. Like, sure, it was a bad thing, but like 20 years later, this is a conversation I was having with 3 or 4 different people over a series of months, 10 around the World Cup, you know, so it's 14 years ago. You know, people are saying we know apartheid was bad. We want to fix something, but there's no reason for a tiny market. You've got to think about this, not in ideological terms, but in business terms. South Africa is a tiny market compared to all the other markets in the world. And very often companies come here, they get told how hard it is to do business here, and they just leave. They just don't bother. There's a reason so many big firms don't launch or do launch. And our legislation just has to catch up, frankly.
Okay, that's a much bigger discussion. If we go down that route, we could be here for a while, but it is 30 years, in fact. But let's do this. Should, in your view, in your analysis, right, should we and our government proceed with this deal with Starlink, right? Pros and cons as briefly as you can, right? And certainly what this would mean if we don't get it right.
Well, it won't mean much to us because we don't have it and we don't use it. In terms of the deal, I don't think the government has to do anything. They just have to, in terms of a license, Starlink would have to go through the process. And like I've said, a lot of big firms are like, why have we got to jump through all these hoops? You're going to be less than 1%. 0.5% of the income we make. Why should we bother? And that's what South Africa needs to be aware of. So I don't know what the government's got to do. I certainly don't, as far as I know, for a telecoms operator to operate in South Africa, they have to approach ICASA, apply for a license, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole bunch of legislation around that. So I don't think the president can say, come and join us, we won't do the legislation. I mean, just look at what's happening with the billable. Legislation is an important underpinning. But our legislation does not help us. It doesn't make our economy more competitive. It doesn't make our citizens' lives better. And it's a weird thing. Why must a global company take a global company that doesn't actually, it's not going to actually have any physical presence in the country, doesn't need to. It can have a distributor, it can have, I mean, there are already people buying Starlink terminals, so they're getting them from somewhere. So the government has to just revisit why it's so difficult for international firms to come and do business in South Africa. Yeah,
really interesting, Toby. Thank you so much for speaking to us and giving us some context as well into Starlink, really what it could possibly mean for South Africa if that partnership does indeed take place. The president also talking about it just last week and also mentioning that they have an impact in 70, footprint rather, in 70 countries.